They mocked the janitor, scammed clients, and disrespected their own boss. What they didn't know was that the janitor had been the CEO all along. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Seated at the head of a long, polished conference table, Isaiah Whitmore scanned the faces of his executive team. A multimillionaire real estate mogul, Isaiah had built his company from the ground up, years of sweat, sleepless nights, and sacrifices no one in this room could even imagine. Yet, despite his relentless pursuit of excellence, something was off. His company's name, Whitmore Realty, had become synonymous with success. But recently, the complaints had been piling up: hostile work environment, racial discrimination, unethical sales tactics. At first, he chalked it up to disgruntled employees looking for a payout. But then, an anonymous letter landed on his desk, one that changed everything. It wasn't from a customer or an agent. It was from a janitor in sharp, brutally honest handwriting. The letter painted a picture of the reality behind closed doors. The culture of his company was toxic, poisoned by greed and prejudice. Employees who were supposed to uphold Whitmore Realty's integrity were instead exploiting their positions, belittling those they deemed beneath them, and betraying the very principles Isaiah had fought so hard to establish. Determined to uncover the truth himself, he devised a plan. For weeks, he traded his tailored suits for janitorial uniforms, mopped floors, emptied trash bins, and listened. He witnessed the corruption firsthand, the arrogance, the deception, the blatant disregard for ethical business practices. And worst of all, he saw how they treated those they considered lesser. Now, as he sat before them, their expressions ranging from confusion to arrogance, Isaiah took a deep breath. The time for pretense was over. With a calm yet commanding voice, he spoke. "Gentlemen, let me introduce myself again. My name is Isaiah Whitmore. I am the founder, owner, and CEO of this company. And for the past month, I have been working among you, not as your leader, but as your janitor." A stunned silence fell over the room. Eyes widened, throats cleared, some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Isaiah placed the letter on the table, his voice unwavering. "And thanks to this, I now see the truth. The reckoning had begun. A company rotting from the inside, employees mocking lower-level workers, managers berating staff, a culture driven by arrogance and greed, all under his name." Isaiah clenched his jaw, tapping a pen against the table as he glanced at his executives. They were laughing, scrolling through their phones, completely unbothered. He took a slow breath. These people worked for him, but did they respect him? "All right," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "I want full reports on the departments, sales, our management. I want to know exactly what's going on here." One of the executives, Brandon Ellis, smirked. Arrogant, the kind of guy who talked more than he listened. "Boss, I think you're overreacting." Brandon chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Every company gets complaints. You think Warren Buffett loses sleep over a couple of janitors whining?" The room erupted in laughter. Isaiah didn't. Instead, he leaned forward, locking eyes with Brandon. "I built this company from nothing. Do you know what that means?" Brandon opened his mouth but hesitated. The laughter died down. "It means I know what struggle looks like." Isaiah continued, his voice steady and sharp. "I wasn't born into this. I wasn't handed a silver spoon. And if there's even a fraction of truth in these complaints, I need to see it for myself." Brandon scoffed, crossing his arms. "And how do you plan on doing that?" Isaiah didn't answer because, in that moment, the decision was already made. But no one in that room was ready for what was coming next. The office was silent, the low hum of the fire crackling in the distance the only sound as Isaiah sat alone in his corner space. The vast land of the desert stretched beyond the wooden-framed window. the horizon painted in deep oranges and soft purples. But he wasn't looking at it. His gaze was locked on his reflection in the glass. Was he really about to do this? He ran a hand over his smooth, shaven face, then down to the beaded necklace resting against his chest, one his grandmother had given him. A reminder of where he came from. His clothes, woven from the finest materials, signified power, authority, control. That was what his position demanded. That was what his people expected from him. But none of it had stopped his own employees from turning against him. Deceit. He had to see it with his own eyes, not as Isaiah Whitmore, the CEO, but as someone who could walk through the shadows unseen. His company had become a breeding ground for disrespect. And it was time to uncover the truth himself. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant. Mia. Want me to call HR and start an internal review? He stared at the words for a long moment before replying with just two. Not yet. The next morning, Isaiah drove to a rundown barber shop on 7th Street. He stepped inside as a CEO and walked out as someone else entirely. His hair, once perfectly groomed, was now cut down to a rough buzz, specks of grey showing where his polished image had been. Next, he visited a thrift store, gone with a tailored $10 suits and Italian leather shoes. Instead, he pulled on a pair of faded jeans, scuffed up sneakers, and an oversized janitor's polo, the kind of clothes people look right past. His final stop was the warehouse where all janitorial supplies were managed. One call to HR was all it took to arrange a new hire under a fake name, John Whitman. No one questioned it. No one double-checked. The very next day, John the janitor stepped into the heart of the company, ready to see the truth no report could ever reveal. The janitor clocked in for his first shift at Whitmore Realty. The break room smelled like stale coffee and yesterday's regrets. Isaiah, no. John, stood by the supply closet, pushing an old mop bucket across the tile. At first, no one even acknowledged him. Then came the whispers. A group of junior agents passed by, barely lowering their voices. New janitor looks like he just got out of prison. Man. They'll hire anybody these days. Bet he won't last a week. Isaiah kept his head down, silent, watching. The real estate floor was a jungle, filled with sharp-dressed predators circling their next commission check. He saw agents lying to clients about limited-time offers, twisting words to force desperate families into terrible mortgage deals in the back. The accounting team was cracking jokes at the expense of a temp worker, an older woman struggling to enter data fast enough. And then there was Brandon Ellis, the executive from the meeting, standing by the receptionist's desk. He leaned in way too close, flashing a sleazy smile. Come on, Lexi, just one drink. You know you want to say yes. The young woman's body language screamed discomfort, but she forced a laugh. I really should get back to work. Brandon, he smirked. That's what I like about you, always working hard. But don't act like you're too good for a little fun. Isaiah gripped the mop handle so tight his knuckles turned white. This was just day one, and already, he was disgusted. But what he saw next made his stomach turn. By the third day, Isaiah had seen enough to make his blood boil. But something told him, the worst was yet to come. He worked quietly, pushing his mop, emptying trash cans, listening. It was almost too easy to blend in. No one cared about the janitor. No one lowered their voices. They spoke freely, completely unaware that their words were building their own downfall. The first major red flag came when he was cleaning near the sales bullpen. Listen, Mrs. Carter, one of the top agents, Rick Dawson, said into his headset, reclining in his chair like he owned the place. I get it. You're worried about the payments. But trust me, in 6 months, that mortgage will be the best thing that ever happened to you. Isaiah paused, his hands tightening on the mop handle. He had heard a lot of lies in his time. But something about this place, these people, it reeked of deceit. He kept his head down, but his ears open, and the more he listened, the more he realized, this wasn't just an office with bad actors. It was a breeding ground for corruption. And if he stayed long enough, he'd have everything he needed to bring it down. Ever happened to you? Isaiah paused. The client on the phone sounded nervous. Rick hit the mute button, grinned, then turned to his coworker. These old folks are so easy to manipulate. You hit them with some fancy words and a limited time offer, and boom, they're signing their life away. The two agents high-fived. Isaiah's stomach churned. But it got worse later that day. He was scrubbing the bathroom sinks when the door swung open. Two executives strolled in, Brandon Ellis and another senior manager, Tom Reynolds. They were deep in conversation, oblivious to the fact that the janitor standing just 5 feet away was listening to every word. I swear, Isaiah is getting soft, Brandon scoffed. Man used to be a killer in this industry. Now he's worried about company culture and ethics. Please. Tom chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah. And have you noticed how out of touch he is? Half the time, he doesn't even know what's happening on the ground level. That's why we get away with so much. Isaiah stared at his own reflection. In the mirror, they saw a man they thought was weak, a joke, an absentee leader. Isaiah gripped the edge of the sink, steadying himself, resisting the storm rising within. He would not explode. Not here, not now. But the fire burned deep. Waiting that evening, just before the office shut down, Isaiah walked into the break room. His goal was simple: finish wiping the tables, then go home and let his mind settle. Let his spirit breathe after all he had witnessed that day. But the moment he stepped inside, he stopped cold. A loose circle of men stood laughing, their voices carrying an air of mockery. In the middle of them stood Miguel, the older janitor, holding his mop, his shoulders slumped, his eyes cast downward. In front of him lay a dark stain of spilled coffee, shards of glass glinting under the fluorescent lights. Brandon stood nearby, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. Well, you going to clean it up? Or just stand there? Miguel bent down, moving with the quiet patience of a man who had seen too much, lived too long to fight battles he knew he wouldn't win. He reached for the broken glass, his fingers hovering over the jagged edges. One of the agents shook his head, chuckling. Careful, Miguel. Don't want you bleeding all over the place. Ain't got time for HR paperwork today. The laughter swelled. It echoed in Isaiah's chest like the wind before a storm. He couldn't take it anymore. He stepped forward, voice steady, eyes hard. That's enough. The room fell silent. Brandon turned, raising an eyebrow, measuring him, as if deciding whether Isaiah was worth the trouble. But Isaiah already knew the answer. This was his moment, his stand, and he would not back down. Isaiah swallowed down the fury burning in his chest. The man's been working here longer than most of you. Show some respect. The group snickered. Brandon took a step closer. Towering over him, Isaiah clenched his jaw. His respect for the janitor was unwavering, but the arrogance in the room was suffocating. He wanted so badly to rip off the disguise right then and there, to show them exactly who they were talking to. But he wasn't done yet. Instead, he locked eyes with Brandon and said evenly, "You never know who's watching. Man, be careful who you disrespect." Brandon laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Whatever you say, buddy. Now get back to work." Isaiah forced himself to walk away. But as he left the break room, his heart pounded with one undeniable truth. Tomorrow morning, everything would change. And when the real Isaiah Whitmore walked into that office, heads would roll the next morning. The office felt the same, casual, arrogant, filled with people who thought they ran the place. But today was different. Isaiah Whitmore wasn't pushing a mop bucket anymore. He wasn't wearing a janitor's uniform, and when he stepped through the doors, the weight of his presence alone was enough to shift the air. The janitor's uniform was gone. He was back in his tailored navy blue suit, polished boots, and a watch worth more than most of these people's trucks, walking through the front doors of his company. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just a CEO, he was a man on a mission. The receptionist, Lexi, looked up, her face instantly flushing red. "Mr. Whitmore, I didn't know you were coming in this early." Isaiah nodded once, but his eyes were already scanning the office floor. Brandon was laughing with a few other executives. The sales agents were already pitching their shady deals to unsuspecting morning clients. Over at accounting, they were making their usual snide remarks about the lower-level staff. Same office, same people. People who had no idea their entire world was about to be turned upside down. "Attention, everyone," Isaiah's assistant, Mir, announced over the intercom. "All employees are required in the conference room immediately. Attendance is not optional." Murmurs spread across the office like wildfire. "What's going on?" Brandon stretched his arms, letting out a deep yawn as he strolled into the council chamber. "This better not be a waste of time," he muttered to Tom, his voice low. "Is this about complaints?" "Nah, probably some new policy talk." Silence swept over the room as Isaiah walked in. Gone was the quiet, often overlooked caretaker. Now, every set of eyes rested on the man who provided for their families, the one whose decisions shaped their livelihood. Isaiah moved with purpose, setting down a stack of folders before them. His gaze traveled across the room, meeting each person's eyes, measuring them. Finally, he spoke. "In this council, we have ways, traditions, and a code that binds us together." His voice was steady, deliberate. "Over the past week, I have seen things with my own eyes. Disrespect, dishonor, a breaking of trust between kin." A few shifted uncomfortably. Some glanced at one another, unsure of where this was going. Isaiah opened the first folder, his fingers firm on the worn edges. "Let's start with you, Rick Dawson." Rick blinked, caught off guard. Yes sir." Isaiah began reading, word for word, the conversation he had overheard. Rick's face drained of color. I never said that." He stammered. Isaiah didn't flinch. With a sharp motion, he slapped the folder shut. "You're fired." Effective immediately. A ripple of shock spread through the room. But Isaiah wasn't done. He turned to another agent. "You laughed along to these predator sales tactics." A pause, steady as the drumbeat before a storm. "You're fired." His gaze swept to the accounting team. "Mocking your own coworkers?" His voice was like flint striking stone. "Fired." And then, finally, he turned to Brandon Ellis. Brandon smirked, trying to play it cool. "Come on, Isaiah. You're really going to listen to a bunch of whining?" Isaiah didn't blink. "I listened to you, Brandon. The things you've said, the way you've treated people you think are beneath you." The room was still. The weight of his words sank in, heavy as the mountain before the storm. Then came the final blow. "You don't work here anymore. Get out." The smirk vanished. Brandon's bravado cracked. "You can't be serious." Isaiah cut him off with a single, icy stare. "Maya, call security if Mr. Ellis doesn't leave on his own." The air felt thick, charged. For the first time in his life, Brandon looked small, weak, humiliated. His chair scraped against the floor as he pushed back, face burning. He stormed out, and just like that, the storm had passed. The empire of arrogance had begun to crumble. But not everyone was cast out that day. Isaiah turned his gaze toward those who hadn't actively participated yet had chosen silence. The ones who had stood by, watching, with the potential to become just as complicit. "You have a choice," he told them, his voice steady. "This company is changing. If you want to stay, you will respect every single person who walks through these doors. You will treat clients fairly. You will uphold the values this company was built on." He paused, sweeping his eyes across the room. "And if that's a problem for you, there's the door." Silence hung thick in the air. Then, slowly, heads began to nod. Some employees got up and left without a word. Others remained, their expressions shifting, their minds processing what had just unfolded for the first time in a long time. The office felt different. This wasn't just about removing the toxic. It was about rebuilding something worth being proud of, but the real challenge was only beginning by lunchtime. The shift was palpable. The air felt lighter. The weight of unspoken resentment and unchecked arrogance had been lifted. Some desks sat empty, their previous occupants escorted out by security. Others remained occupied, their owners sitting quietly, deep in thought, adjusting to the new reality. Change had come, and there was no turning back. "Deal, you're out." Isaiah's voice was firm. Elliot swallowed hard. "Mr. Whitmore, I never meant to." Isaiah cut him off. "I don't want excuses. I want change. Prove to me that you can do better." Elliot nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I will." Isaiah held his gaze for a moment before moving on. Some people, when given a second chance, rise to the occasion, and some never changed before the day ended. Isaiah found himself outside the janitorial supply closet. Inside, Miguel was folding towels. For a long moment, Isaiah just stood there. This man had been humiliated right in front of him. Sure, Isaiah had intervened, at least a little. But he hadn't stopped it. He stepped inside. Miguel turned, blinking in surprise. "Mr. Whitmore," Isaiah hesitated. "I owe you an apology." Miguel tilted his head, confused. "I saw how they treated you," Isaiah admitted, "and I didn't stop it right away." Miguel smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You were learning," he said gently. "I could see it." Isaiah no longer led from behind his desk. Each week, he walked the floors, spoke with his people, and listened, not just to their words, but to what lay beneath them. He had come to understand the greatest lesson of his journey. A leader is only as strong as those who stand beside him. One evening, Isaiah sat in his office, a single letter in his hands. But this was no complaint, no demand. It was a thank you. A letter from Miguel, from Lexi, from Elliot, from voices once silent, now heard. He let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair, feeling the weight of the moment. Then, he looked up, his gaze steady, his voice clear. "Power does not come from a title," he said. "It comes from how you treat people. If you truly want to know a person, watch them when they think no one is looking." He let the words settle, like the last embers of a fire glowing in the night. Then, leaning forward, his tone quiet yet unwavering, he asked, "So, I ask you, who are you when no one is watching?" A pause. The stillness heavy with meaning. "Because one day," he continued, his voice steady as a drum's beat, "someone will be watching, and when that day comes, make sure you are proud of what they see." Fade to black. Black. If this story made you think, hit that like button. If you believe in leadership with integrity, share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, respect is not given by words alone, but earned in the way we walk with others. Stay true. Stay real.